Welcome to our March edition of Ask an Advocate from the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Domestic Violence. On March 14th, we recognized Equal Pay Day, a day that represents how far into the year the average woman has to work in order to have earned what the average man had earned the entire previous year. This day is meant to bring awareness to the gender wage gap in the United States and the problems that pay inequity causes for women. PCADV identified pay equity as an important priority for us as an organization. And in 2018, Aishwarya Sinha joined our team to research the gender wage gap as an issue in Pennsylvania and how it impacts risk factors for domestic violence. In 2021, Aishwarya published PCADV's Pay Equity Report, and today is releasing a brand new infographic with a set of action steps for both organizations and individuals, with important updates since the first report was released. Aishwarya is joining us today to talk about the work PCADV is doing around pay equity, the current state of the gender wage gap, why the gender wage gap matters for victims and survivors of domestic violence, and some impacts of recent current events. We're also here to answer your questions, so please feel free to drop any questions you have in the comments on Facebook, and we will get to as many of those as we can. So welcome, Aishwarya. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Lauren. So glad to be here.
I'd like for us to begin today by asking you, why is PCADV interested in the gender wage gap, and how does it impact or intersect with our work to end domestic violence?
So that's a great question. So PCADV actually sees the connection from pay inequity to domestic violence in two ways. One, the gender wage gap or pay inequity creates conditions like poverty, housing insecurity, harmful gender norms that we all know are risk factors for someone to experience intimate partner violence. So I'll give you an example for Pennsylvania. If pay equity is achieved, half of the women working full-time in the United States and even in Pennsylvania would be raised out of poverty. And as poverty is a risk factor for intimate partner violence, achieving pay equity and reducing the rates of women in poverty can help reduce the number of women at risk for violence. Now, the second factor is when domestic violence exists and someone is being paid inequitably, barriers are created that make it challenging for victims and survivors to leave abusive relationships and find independence. Now, these barriers may diminish the survivor's capacity to support themselves, support their family, and force them to depend on the abuser financially.
Thank you so much for explaining that. And I think it's important to understand how interconnected these issues are and why we're here talking about it today. So one of the things that you highlight in the new infographic is the fact that the wage gap is a systemic issue rather than the result of individual choices made by individual women. Can you explain what we mean by that and how systemic issues impact pay equity?
Sure, let me actually share the infographic so everyone can take a look. Are you able to see that, Lauren?
It's great, yep.
Awesome. So yeah, so this is the new infographic. It's on our website, and Lauren's going to drop it in the chat as well. So I do talk about why the wage gap matters and how it's a systemic issue and not a result of individual choice. Now, there are a lot of different perceptions folks have on gender wage gap. They think if women get another job or if they get another degree, the wage gap would automatically cease to exist. However, that's not true. Wage gap is a systemic issue. It exists regardless of the industry and job in which a woman is employed, whether they have a bachelor's degree or PhD, whether they are married or not, or whether they have a child or not. The wage gap actually begins right out of college, and women are often offered lesser starting salaries and are less likely to be employed in their first year out of college. And when they do have a steady job, women earn less, and young women contribute a more significant portion of their salaries to repaying student loans. Now, as you can see, I have some facts listed. Women even suffer from the wage gap as they progress along the educational ladder. Now, women who work full-time and have a master's degree still get only paid 70 cents for every dollar a man is paid. And even if they earn PhD, their weekly earnings is still less than what men make despite having a bachelor's or a PhD. And even in fields that they dominate, like social work or academics, the wage gap exists and women are paid less than their male counterparts.
Thanks, Shaswarya. Yeah, I think that that's a really good point to focus on, that the choice of job, what industry you happen to be in, what level of education a woman has, all of those things are not factors that determine the gender wage gap. The gender wage gap exists within each of those things. So I'm glad that we're talking about that and making sure people understand that this isn't just an overall calculation based on every single job. It also exists within each of these industries, within jobs, within different levels of education. So hopefully people can see that unfortunately, it doesn't kind of matter what career a woman chooses, she's still most likely going to earn less than her male counterparts doing the same type of work within that industry that she is doing.
Definitely, like look at any industry, legal field or healthcare, even in like all these higher paying professions like finance or tech, there's a wage gap, and the wage gap is even worse in those industries.
Yeah, I actually was looking at something this week in preparation for our discussion today that was showing specifically nonprofit CEOs and executive directors, and the gender wage gap is actually larger for those individuals than it is for like the overall average like median number for all women. So even in fields where we tend to see more women nowadays represented, yes, like you said, that wage gap still exists, even in jobs that we typically associate with women over men.
Yes.
I also wanted to ask you and talk a little bit about the motherhood penalty and how the lack of adequate supports for families, like affordable childcare and paid family leave for both mothers and fathers, can impact pay equity for women who have children, and how their careers are affected by having children.
Sure. So let me just share the quick facts that I have. Currently in 2022, working mothers are only paid 63 cents for every dollar a father makes. And I'll just stop sharing so folks can see my face. Now, what Lauren said, motherhood penalty, is actually the cost a woman bears when she decides to have a child. And a study done by Cornell University, when comparing equally qualified women candidates, discovered that women who were mothers were offered lower starting salaries and were perceived less competent and less likely to be hired than non-mothers, whereas the effect on fathers in the study were just the opposite. And even among mothers in the same ethnicity, a lot of folks are single breadwinners. So for these women, the gender wage gap is quite punishing, because they have to manage higher expenses of running the household single-handedly and choosing to get education or saving for emergency fund. Now we talk about like the action steps in the infographic, and one of the recommended action steps is parental leave and access to childcare. Research finds that these action steps can actually help share gender norms, and states that offer childcare have a smaller pay gap on average, because these steps can also help promote equity and equality in relationships. It can decrease the likelihood of experiencing DV as well.
Yeah, I think it's important to talk about this in specific relationship to mothers, because unfortunately in a lot of households today, a lot of the domestic work, a lot of the childcare, a lot of the unpaid labor that has to occur in order for a family and a household to run still falls disproportionately to women. And so like there's those challenges happening at home, and then they're also being discriminated against when they go for jobs, or when they're getting determined how much they're going to be offered in terms of salary, what they're going to make. And as you mentioned, like even compared to women with the exact same qualifications, the exact same level of education, just because of the fact that they are mothers, are seen as less likely to do the job well, to deserve as much pay, et cetera. So, I think that that's really something important for us to talk about. And I love that we have that in the action steps, something that organizations, without any kind of, laws or anything, like an organization can just do this right now on their own. They can just choose to provide a little bit more support to both the mothers and fathers that work in their organizations to help close the gender wage gap. Obviously, there's some broader, bigger scale policy things that we would love to happen as well. But there are things that we as individuals and organizations can do right now to help this cause. So I also wanted to make sure that we talk about the fact that the wage gap is significantly worse for women of color and also for women with disabilities. In the report, you wrote that we cannot address the gender wage gap without addressing racism. So I wanted to see if you could tell us where women of color currently stand, where women with disabilities currently stand in the gender wage gap, and what can be done to help close the gap for these populations.
Yes, so the pay gap numbers are very different for women of color and women with disabilities, and the gap is actually further widened for women of color who have to face the additional discrimination of racism and also additional discrimination which leads to further social and financial hindrances. So currently in 2023, Black women only earn 63 cents and Latinas earn close to 54 cents for every dollar a white man is paid. And women of all major racial and ethnic groups still earn less than men of the same group and also earn less than white men. Even in our state, Pennsylvania, Black women earn I think $17,000 less every year than the average Pennsylvania white man per year. And like I mentioned, this wage gap starts right out of college. Research shows that more women than men of color are graduating from college, but the impact of student loans and the fact that they're offered lesser starting salaries just further worsens the gender-based wage gap. And since they're making less in earned income, they're unable to repay it or save money for building wealth. And in fact, for women with disability, regardless of what occupation they are in, if they're part-time or full-time, they only earn 68 cents for every dollar a white non-Hispanic man with disability makes. And in fact, disabled women only make 72 cents for every dollar earned by a white disabled man. And even with the attainment of higher degrees, the wage gap still remains very significant. And workers with disabilities who have a master's degree still earn only close to 67,000 annually. So the wage gap is significant, and there needs to be policies and practices in place to definitely address this issue.
Wonderful. And I'm hoping that we'll get into what some of those policies and practices could be in a little bit later when we start to talk about the action steps. Wonderful. And I also wanted to touch on how recent current events have impacted the gender wage gap. For instance, if you could fill us in on what has happened since the pandemic. I mean, that impacted a lot of people in many ways. And I know that the wage gap and pay equity is one of those. So what has the effect of the pandemic been on the gender wage gap?
Sure. I'll just share the infographic again, because we have some great infos on the pandemic as well as the recent tech layoffs. Now, actually, the COVID-19 has been called a she session because with the onset of COVID, more women than men lost their jobs. And most of the women who lost their jobs were low-wage workers. There was inability to access affordable childcare, additional household work, inflexible work schedules, and the impact of remote work led to a massive exit of women from the workforce. And till date, we don't have the full data to understand the impact, but what we do know is working women and women of color have been particularly impacted by the pandemic, and ever since the pandemic began, people are having a harder time finding employment because there's a lack of safe parent paid leave, there's lack of childcare, there's lack of affordable childcare options, and the work that women do continue to be grossly undervalued, and they're paid unequally, which puts them at even a higher risk of experiencing all the risk factors of intimate partner violence. And the tech layoffs that started in 2022, I mean, more than 152K employees from various global tech companies were laid off all over the world, and women only represent a minority of the population in tech industry, but there were almost 50% of women workers laid off between September to December of last year. And we don't have the full data for this yet, because this is an ongoing development and it's still taking place. But women who were employed in the tech industries, what we found out, they worked in non-technical departments. And when it came to laying off workers, individuals in these roles were more likely to face layoffs. And because companies viewed them as less essential, their work was again grossly undervalued. So they were laid off, and when fired from their jobs, women now have to think about additional factors when they think about getting a new job. They have to think about maternity leave, they have to think about cost of childcare, they have to think about the work schedules, and that kind of limits their options when they're applying for a new job. And women of color have the added stress of not knowing how diverse or welcoming a new job environment might be, and that's just further worsening the wage gap that already exists.
Thank you for that update, Aishwarya. That's unfortunate to hear that we've had some setbacks even. And a question that we had come in was that, there was an Equal Pay Act in the 1960s. Why wasn't that enough to achieve pay equity? There's been legislation passed. Shouldn't that have fixed the problem?
Yeah, so that's the only reason for that is discrimination, because there are so many loopholes in the act itself that employers use that to discriminate against their employees. Sometimes, for example, they'll change the job titles for the same job responsibility, and female workers get different job titles, male workers get different job titles. And when asked, or when when they're held accountable that why this discrimination, and if the job responsibility is the same, why not paying us the same salary, they come up with this excuse that, since the job title is different, the responsibilities are different. So these are some of these loopholes lead to employers getting away with this and not actually abiding by the Equal Pay Act.
Another question that we had, Min, and I know that there's something a little bit further up in the infographic. So before we switch out of that, I wanted to touch base on this. When can we expect to see pay equity at the rate that we're going out at now? And I know that that's different for different groups of women. So I'll actually
share that screen too. But so according to the Institute for Women's Policy Research, right now with the change, it's so slow that it will take around 40 to 60 years to see equal pay and pay equity becoming a national phenomena. And for Black women and Latinas and other people of color, the wage gap will not even close for the next 200 years. And even in Pennsylvania, I think it's going to take another 60 years to see pay equity.
That's quite a ways off. So might as well use that to transition into what we can do to try to improve that outlook and make that timeline not so far out. So a big portion of the newly released gender wage gap infographic fact sheet is about specific action steps that both individuals can take, the organizations can take to help us close the gender wage gap and move up that timeline. So I'd like to ask and begin talking about the action steps from an organizational perspective, starting with what is PCADV currently doing as an organization to help close the gender wage gap and support economic justice?
Sure. So for PCADV, pay equity work is definitely one of the priorities. Apart from like publishing resources and information on the wage gap, we've also started a financial workshop for advocates. It's sort of a learning opportunity that helps them learn better about financial abuse, ways to prevent it, how to manage debt. And the trainings are on YouTube. We can drop the link to that as well. But in addition, PCADV is also taking a lot of steps within the domestic violence field to better pay advocates and decrease pay inequity. So we've banned the salary history question from our job applications. And we've also started publishing salary ranges on the job postings on our website. Now, these action steps are very important because they promote transparency and are definitely a step towards closing the wage gap. Because like banning the salary history, if folks are paid unequally at one job, and if we ask for their salary history, we're setting them up in the same cycle. So PCADV actually wants to break those cycles. And with posting salary ranges as well, our goal was to be transparent and be clear and upfront about the pay. It definitely offers transparency when job applicants are negotiating their pay. They know upfront what the range is and puts the onus of pay equity on us, PCADV, who has to determine what to pay folks rather than asking the candidate to decide their worth and decide their pay. So these are some of the steps that we have started taking.
I love that. It stinks going to a job interview and them asking you like how much how much do you want to get paid for the job?
Yeah.
I love that that's not on the applicant, that's something that we're just publishing and putting out there so that there's no question and no hidden agenda, because you don't want to undersell yourself and put yourself in a position to not make as much as you could if you knew what they were actually valuing the position and valuing the work at. As far as the salary history, you mentioned that that wage gap starts for women like right out of college. And so if you're starting off already disadvantaged and then people are asking your salary and that just continues, how are we ever going to get out? So I'm glad that PCADV is taking those steps to help that we ourselves are walking the walk, since we're asking other organizations and individuals to join us in this work as well. But what are some other things that organizations can do if they want to be part of the solution and they want to start helping to close the gap?
I mean, there are several pieces when put together can get us closer to pay equity. Now, organizations and employers can definitely promote an equal pay culture by, including policies like flexible work schedules or remote work. And like I mentioned, banning salary history question or posting the salary ranges just to be clear and upfront. These can definitely help promote pay equity. And some of the other things are like conducting pay equity audit to ensure employees are being paid fairly and analyzing job descriptions from time to time to remove any unnecessary jargon. For example, like not all jobs require an advanced degree. So, or, there are some skills that can be learned while performing the job. So keeping these requirements in check definitely definitely helps expand the candidate pool. And few other things that we definitely think can promote pay equity are safe and sick leave, leave for illness, leave for survivor safety, and a range of like caregiving needs for families. Another thing that employers can do is make sure that women are getting paid living wage. And in fact, like living wage is also not enough. Organizations should actually focus on providing a thriving wage, because living wage only provides for basic needs, whereas a thriving wage provides the amount of money needed for a person to thrive beyond paycheck to paycheck. And, it's beyond survival money. It can actually help individuals start savings. They can, or, they can use it for their hobbies. But these are definitely some of the important things to consider when thinking about how to bring pay equity in your organization. Now, another thing, very, very important thing, is to remember to incorporate diversity and equity and inclusion practices, because we need to remember pay inequity exists because of inequities at structural and policy levels. It's a systemic issue, not an individual choice. So when we make the changes at the structural level, we definitely promote pay equity in organizations among employers.
Awesome. Thanks, Aishwarya. And just as a reminder to folks, these steps can be found on our website. We're going to drop the link in there to our gender wage gap website page. From there, you can get to the updated infographic that has all of the information that Aishwarya shared earlier, and those graphics, as well as a listed out set of steps that you can take to get involved. So what about for individuals who might feel passionate about this and want to do something to help? How can they help close the gender wage gap?
Now, for individuals, I think the most important step is educating themselves and having that awareness. They can definitely look up resources that show the connection between domestic violence and pay inequity. They can take many of these financial courses that are available. I think the American Association for University Women has one, All State Foundation has one, and yes, PCADV also has a resource list that may help individuals learn more. And definitely check out our website, because we have a lot of compiled resources there. So yes, I think those are the different steps. Just educating and continuing to learn can help. Individuals can help that way in closing the wage gap.
That's fantastic. I think one that I would maybe want to add in there is if you are a woman, talk about money more with your friends who are women. And if you work with women of color, tell them share your salary, tell them what you make. I know it's uncomfortable, and I know that can be weird, but one of the best things that we can do for each other is to be transparent about at least what we're making, to help everybody, get to the same place, and uncover inequities if there are some out there. So we don't often talk about money, but doing so can help too. All right. Anything else, Aishwarya, that you would add as a parting thought for everybody on the gender wage gap and domestic violence?
I think just that there needs to be a level of change, and just continuing to educate ourselves, and accessing the resources that are available to us can definitely be a step in the right direction.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today, for talking about this. We really appreciate, and all of us here at PCADV are super proud of the work that you've been doing around this issue. And just so everybody knows, Aishwarya and the project prevention team have won some awards around this work, and have recently been recognized by the CDC for this work around the gender wage gap and pay equity. So please go to our website, check out all of the information that we have on there, the research that Aishwarya has done. Look at the action steps, take some action steps. We hope that you will get involved. So thank you so much, Aishwarya, and thanks for joining us. Everybody have a great day.
Thank you.